All right, hello and welcome. It's just a couple minutes after 10. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our webinar on modern mobility, jointly presented by UNICEPTA and the Center for Automotive Research. I'm Jennifer Rutherford, the Director of Business Development for UNICEPTA US. On behalf of both groups, I want to thank you for taking an interest in our presentation today. We're very excited to share with you a comparative analysis of the media's perception on green mobility compared to the consumer habits in the mobility industry. Our speakers today are Ms. Silke Nalig and Ms. Carla Balo. Silke is a managing director at UNICEPTA with over 15 years of experience in global media and data intelligence. She supports multinational companies on how to best use data-driven insights to master the challenges of communication in a digital environment. Carla is the president and CEO of the Center for Automotive Research and is a leader in engineering and vehicle program management, with 35 years of experience in the automotive industry. Under her leadership, CAR continues to be a preeminent resource of objective and unbiased research, analysis, and information regarding the North American automotive industry. One quick housekeeping item before we begin. As we go through our presentation today, we hope it leads to questions. If you have a question for our speakers, please type it into the Q&A box, which should be found at the bottom of your screen. We will round up the questions and try to get to as many as possible toward the end of the presentation. And now I will pass it to Carla, who will set the stage for our discussion today.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. I really appreciate that kind introduction. I'm really looking forward to this and getting the questions from the audience. The automotive mobility space is undergoing one of the greatest transformations ever. And it's really quite interesting to see what the chatter is in the press, and then to talk about what people are actually doing, what companies are doing as well, and trying to align those. So I look forward to today's conversation. And when we talk about the main thrust right now globally is electrification. It's really changing the story, even throughout the pandemic, electrification, electrified vehicles. The sales continue to go up. Governments are still strongly supporting. We're seeing a lot of incentives, a lot of talk about charging networks and public policy. So let me just go through some of the key pillars of electrification. First starting, I talked a little bit just now about regulatory, but it's truly happening on a global level. And from a regulation standpoint, from China, from Europe, various countries in Europe are also different. The US now, under the new administration, everyone is looking towards what we can do to improve our global climate, how we can reduce carbon emissions. Transportation now is the #1 cause of our carbon footprint. How can we bring that down in totality? The technology for batteries is moving at an exponential pace. The range of the vehicles, the cost of the batteries, everything is becoming much more affordable. Although still the cost of an electric vehicle is quite high, that I'll share with you later. But there's a lot of discussion now that's predicting by 2025, we could have parity with internal combustion engines in terms of EV cost. We're seeing a lot of great product entries. Many announcements from automakers about the number of vehicles, the skateboards they're going to be producing, the different top hats that are available to go on those skateboards. And then what's really compelling is a lot of the high performance vehicles that are now becoming electrified. And this really indicates electric vehicles are not just runaround vehicles. They're performance vehicles. They're fun to drive. They'll fit into your lifestyle. From a finance perspective, ESG is becoming predominant. Many investors are not investing in companies unless they have a strong ESG component, E being environmental. And this is not just the products they produce, but also their manufacturing footprint. And those companies are being rewarded not only with their share price, but also when they do an IPO, or today the more common way for a lot of the small EV companies is through SPACs. Market share is increasing. Real gas prices have gone up. We know that because of a number of reasons, and I'll talk about those again later. But the market share is increasing without regard to fuel price. And we'll show some compelling evidence of that later in the slide deck today. So it's all about electrification, and we'll see now what the media is saying. And I'll turn it back over to Silke.
Thank you, Carla. So what we are doing as a first step to put that into the media background and into the media context, we are looking at the past year. What was the media discussion like, and how big is green mobility, and then later on electrification really within the media discussion around mobility and automotive. So what we did is we looked at the data from April last year to March this year. So we cut off end of March, which is relevant for the discussion. So we'll see that later on. There are probably some pieces missing that will be quite interesting moving forward. We looked especially at the discussion in online and social media. We used a method based on artificial intelligence and really looking at big data to get the trends and to understand what is being talked about and what is the center of it. So putting it into the context, the last year was, of course, dominated by the discussion around COVID, about anything around that and the potential economic impacts on companies, on industries, and also on automotive. But still, like we see in the middle and overall, the discussion around sustainability, climate crisis, climate change in general, and then in context of that, green mobility, stayed not only on a constant level, but with COVID, with the COVID discussion going down again, it increased in visibility and seems to be a catalyst for the overall topics in that, for the overall discussion in that surrounding. And we see that also, I mean, here are just some snippets, which is the basis of the media analysis, what we do, but you all follow the stories and see that the pandemic and the actual political development is really creating, or it seems like it's creating, a window of opportunity for the EV market. And as I said, the focus is more and more on sustainability and on green topics and green mobility. At the same time, people are expecting in the context of COVID that the overall context of modern mobility is changing. So we are facing challenges like how do we drive safe? How do we commute safe? The market, the automotive market, is getting a boost out of that because people are turning more and more towards to individual mobility again. And with that in mind, there is the idea about modern mobility surfacing more and more. So of course, the normal discussion about automotive and mobility is still focused on the product coverage. It's about the products, the brands, the potential that we have, the new models, having market entries. But at the same time, the media and the social media, especially in the community, is also looking at those fancy topics, trending topics like tech aspects, but also, of course, on safety topics in the context of COVID, and the green topics. So if we look at it from an analytics perspective, e-mobility and battery cell technology alone take up 25% of all the coverage in the context of modern mobility. And at the same time as the mobility community, as well as the finance community, is watching this and is looking at it, the car makers are measured against those sustainability strategies. So what we saw in the last year, especially, is that everybody needs to come up with a strategy. Everybody is asked, what is your plan for e-mobility? What do you have in the bag for battery cell technology? And this is where we see everybody positioning themselves. Taking a look at the individual markets, looking of where is the discussion especially strong, leading us towards the US, we see that the green mobility issue is is growing in all countries, or everywhere it's around 50%. But still in the US, it's comparably low and small. The autonomous is very big. Everybody is focusing on the tech issues, of course, also driven by several events and of course the big players in that context who seem to look mostly at that issues. But green mobility is coming up and is taking more room or more space within the media discussion. And now when we look at that, and that's what I meant when we said that we cut off the data at March 31st. So with the announcement of the Biden plan, actually, that was the last day of our data. So it can be expected that this attention for green mobility and especially for e-mobility and the EV market is growing further and is giving an additional momentum for the industry. So if we dive into the US market, so far we have looked at it from a global perspective and what is discussed within the US market and where is the focus within it and within the green topics. Of course, e-mobility and battery technology, they are still the runners and everybody is interested in how this is developing and what is discussed around that. But what is interesting is that while e-mobility has a constant buzz, there is always the discussion and not to forget, and we will see that later on, Tesla is driving that with a constant comparison and really being on top of the media. We have a few peaks that are quite interesting, and these are mostly towards battery technology. So within the last 6 months, we had a few announcements that really drove these peaks and that drove the coverage around battery technology. And that again gives us an indication of what the media are interested in. So while there is of course the constant discussion, we need more e-mobility and the battery technology is evolving. Once the mobility players are joining into an event or even doing an event themselves, like NIO did at the beginning of the year, the media are actually jumping on it and looking at it and taking an interest into what is introduced there, what is their plan. Everybody is asked and everybody needs to come up with a plan for the next years, mostly looking at the 2030s. So there we see that this is really something where you as a company or as a communication department can position yourself more successfully in the context of green mobility. Yes, Carla, did you have something to add or did I miss that?
No, nothing at all. Please go on.
Okay. So we saw already, and that's what I meant, that the several events and activities of the car makers and of mobility players are driving the topic. So what we did now is to really understand who is driving the coverage and who are driving the topics. We looked into the specific media set and media coverage to understand what company is mostly mentioned in that context. We again looked at battery technology, e-mobility, and also hydrogen, the big three topics within green mobility. And of course, not surprisingly, Tesla is leading the field, not in all three of them, but in those two that are most visible. However, what we need to keep in mind is that Tesla is mostly mentioned and always a reference. It's really still over the past years, it had been more than a synonym to be used in terms of e-mobility. And so whenever any news are coming up, Tesla has a big chance to be just mentioned, which is probably why they don't need a PR department anymore. But then we see that the big legacy automakers, they are actually gaining ground. So before the last year, I would say it was difficult to have any individual topics around that. But with everybody coming up with a plan, having their own technology, having new market entries, or at least the planned market entries, we see that within these topics, there are the big car makers who are making room and who are really driving the topics. And as I said, this is mostly connected to announcements, to activities, and there we see how successful this is and how big of a room they get in that connection. But again, or not again, but also what is important in that context, and here we see Apple making an entry. Of course, these fancy fields and these very interesting fields of new topics and of green topics, sustainability, they make room, or they make an opportunity for any disruptors and newcomers to enter the field and to enter the market. So they just need to announce that they have a plan. Of course, Apple has it easier than any other disruptor would have it, but they just need to come up and show we have a plan and we also want to be part of the market. And then everybody jumps on top of that and really mentions it or gives it some visibility in that context. So looking at the tonality and at the and please keep in mind this is an automated tonality, but looking at it and how the share within the coverage is, we see already something which we will look at in a few minutes even deeper, that this topic of e-mobility is a very ambivalent topic. So there are discussions towards positive and negative. Every aspect and every topic within that overall field has its positive and its negative aspects. And it seems like there is no real winning field within these. However, and that we also see in other sectors like the finance sector, it's the same game everywhere. The disruptors, there are disruptors and newcomers coming either from markets that have more experience with that field and with that topic, or just joining the market as a newcomer, just entering it with new products. And of course, they have it much easier in terms of media resonance and media image, because they don't have any legacy. That's why we call it Legacy Automakers. They don't have any of these topics that make it difficult. They don't have to answer any questions about job cuts yet. They don't have to come up with a 30-year plan. They don't have to come up with an argument why they changed their strategy now. They are just there and say, look what we have and what great technology we have. So this is, of course, their opportunity, but at the same time, it's also the highest risk. And this is what makes the legacy automakers strong, because at the same time, like they have new topics, it can also happen like that media look at it and say, this is not promising. We just don't focus on it anymore. So it is not very sustainable, so to say, within the coverage. And here the legacy automakers have really room to build up their stories, to show that it is promising, that it is viable, and that the plan is moving towards the future. And then, of course, the individual role that Tesla still has, they are connected, they have the visibility, they always are mentioned, but they have a lot of critical topics in that context which they have to deal with, and so they are really, the whole visibility is not always good for them, and they always have to manage the critical issues in that context. So when I said we are in a field within the tonality, and we have a very ambivalent topic structure, looking at what is the challenge for communication, and looking at the media coverage in that context, we will see later on that, or Carla already mentioned it in the beginning, that the consumer is really interested in range, in the supply chain, in the infrastructure. These are very practical questions. What can I do? How can I drive my vehicle? How do I get it? What is included there? And the media, they focus very much on the strategy. What does that mean for the car maker strategy? What does that mean for sustainability? What is the movement? What does that do for the climate? But the questions of the consumer are not answered to that extent that there is a satisfaction, and that the aspects are mostly positive. So we always have both aspects. There's the anxiety that I can't get far enough with my car, that there might be enough charging stations, and also the question, well, even though I don't have any emission, but what about the supply chain, and how sustainable is that really? So these are the picky questions, so to say, but also the basic questions that I believe will be relevant when we look at the market data later, because that is what is then driving the sales behind it.
Thank you, Silke. Great introduction. There was a couple of things that I just wanted to comment on that I find compelling in the data that you just shared. And one was looking at the US data and seeing that the AV amount of press was over, the talk of EVs, when we've actually seen more delays in the AV space. Then we're actually, seeing announcements and real action happening in the EV. I think, as you rightly say, though, now that we have the new administration and the new Biden plan, infrastructure plan that's been announced, and more to come, of course, that should increase, and already has, probably within the month of April. And the other thing that I find really interesting is Tesla has a large share of the EV hype, but they also have the most negative portion of the share, and it doesn't seem to be harming them at all. So it's interesting. The legacy automakers are always very fearful of that negativity, but it doesn't seem to trouble Tesla or their share price. So I think it'll be interesting to watch this trend over time and see how things progress in these areas. So those are just a couple of things that I thought were really fascinating when I looked at the data. So what's happening? What are the facts here? I am now in control of the screen and changing it, I believe.
Should be.
Yeah. We're trying, here we go. Sometimes it just takes time in the cyberspace. So if we look at what's happened, over the past 20 years, fundamentally, for electrified vehicle sales, and we have electrified vehicle sales, it means all forms of electrification, everything from fully electric to hybrids to fuel cells and plug-in hybrids. So over the past several years, and I don't know why it did that, but we seem to have a delay. I'm going to move it back, maybe. Sorry about this technical issue. Is there someone on your side that can take it? Yeah, please take it and I'll stop.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you, and I'll just say next.
You just tell me.
Apologies to the viewers. So as I was saying, over the last few years, electrification really started to ramp up around the time the Leaf was introduced in 2012 by Nissan. And since that time, it was fairly steady until about 2018, 2017, 18, when we started seeing Tesla really come on board. And what's really interesting is normally we've seen a correlation to fuel price. And you can see the fuel price in green. But then since 2019, that hasn't really been the case. Fuel prices continue to go down, electrified vehicle sales have continued to go up, and we're strongly seeing that trend continue through the pandemic, through 2020, and now in 2021. Still, the electrified vehicle sales continues to increase. Now, we are seeing some manufacturers who are now launching new models with only hybrid, and primarily from Toyota at the moment, but others are planning to take that route, which, I think we have to make clear that these numbers are all electrified vehicles. So it includes those hybrid vehicles as well. Next page, please. So this data is also pretty darn compelling when we look at the percentage of electrified sales at 7.3. Just in 2019, that figure was around 3.8. So it's almost doubled in the past 2 years. Of course, crossovers, pickups, SUVs continue to lead in the US sales through 2021. We don't see that changing, but the electrified coming up as high as it has and now surpassing almost all of the car segment except small cars, and actually nearing to eclipse that is quite a strong performance. Next page. This shows it a little bit differently, the 3 different kinds of electrified technologies and the sales over the last, again, 20 years, from hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and now fully electrified vehicles. What you're seeing here is hybrids are beginning to rise again. Plug-in electrics are beginning to actually decrease, and battery electrics are continuing to increase in terms of market share. As battery electrics continue to have better range and the costs come down, plug-in hybrids will continue to decrease. Next page. So what matters, you know, and I'm not so sure this is just US customers, this is consumers probably in general. But first, cost. And it's kind of interesting because I'm not so sure we're doing a good job in really educating consumers on the total cost of ownership for an electric vehicle versus an internal combustion engine. But first of all, people look at, you know, just this is what it's going to cost me to get into this product. And right now there's a significant cost differentiator between an internal combustion engine and a battery electric vehicle. Hybrids are starting to come more on par. There's still typically an increase to go from an internal to a hybrid. But when we look at the total cost of ownership, which maybe is what we should be talking to consumers a little bit more about, when you look at the maintenance, when you look at, of course, the difference in fuel cost to electric cost, within a certain period of time, you're able to get that ROI back. And we maybe need to be just talking about that in a little different way with consumers. The other is what we're calling utility parity. And in this case, I think we really have to think about infrastructure. Do they have the charging infrastructure both at home and at the office? Or if they're in a multi-unit dwelling, do they have the capability to be able to charge a vehicle? Does that vehicle also have the range that they need to do what they want to do? Now, what's interesting is during the pandemic, we've seen sales of EVs continue to increase. And it may be due to the fact that people are not driving like they used to do. They realize, hey, I don't really drive as many miles as I thought I did. An electric vehicle can actually fit into my lifestyle in some way. As they, though, continue to think about, will it work for long distance trips? Because people are starting to hit the road again. Many don't want to fly. So they're really looking at driving themselves places. Can I manage that with an electric vehicle? And how long is it going to take me when I do stop to charge it? And then the convenience factor. Again, that charging time, how does that fit into all the things that I want to do today or on my vacation? Will I have access? Will the car know? Will the car tell me and make a reservation at a charging station? All of these things we need to think about when we think about seamlessly fitting electrified vehicles into a consumer's life. It has to happen seamlessly, and it has to happen so that they don't have to do too much pre-planning and thinking about it. The more that we can integrate this and use data analytics, use technology, artificial intelligence to be able to manage that, the better it will be to be able to have more and more consumers at least putting an EV on their shopping list, if not test driving. Next page, please. We know all the automakers are announcing a plethora of electric vehicles in some format over the next several years. The announcements that have already been made are shown here. Battery electric is at the bottom in dark blue, then fuel cells, plug-in, mild hybrid, fuel cells, etc. as we go through this. And I'm sorry, I said the blue was fuel cells. That's actually full hybrid. So full hybrid, plug-in, mild hybrid, and then we go from there. You can see all of the different announcements that have been made. The number of investments in manufacturing facilities that have been announced is very profound. So when we think about all that investment and all of the funding that needs to go into the creation of all of these different models and then the manufacture of all these different models, having the consumer understanding and having that infrastructure is going to be vital for those numbers to be achieved. Next page. And we wanted to kind of show this because earlier Silke talked about disruptors versus legacy automakers. And interestingly enough, you know, you look here and it's the legacy automakers that are really coming forward with these announcements. Proportionally, you know, it's fairly flat from, you know, the mid 20s through 27 in terms of the number of vehicles coming from disruptors. Now, that doesn't mean that that's it, because what the difference is with disruptors and with legacy, disruptors move very, very fast fundamentally. They're not held to what I call the decision-making and the development process machine in the OEMs. They can move fast, they can get funding, which we've seen happening a lot lately through SPACs or through IPOs or through merging with others. And they can suddenly start coming into this portfolio. So yes, this is what's been announced so far, but this is likely to change as we have more and more disruptors, as we have more and more product types that are needed in the mobility ecosystem of the future. Next page. So I think this is where I turn it back to you, Silke.
Yes, so where we combine our data. So like Carla already showed and said, and maybe one step back before we look at that, the disruptors are very strong in media coverage, but mostly first of all, within specific and very limited topic fields. So they are not owning the field. They are just very strong in their own specific topic. I think that's a big opportunity for everybody else out there to really continue to own the other room. And they are not that strong at the market yet. Of course, they are moving fast, like Carla said, but there's still the difference that they need to prove themselves. And that is, of course, the big challenge. Now we saw already the difference of the different technologies and how they are visible and already real within the market. Now, looking at the media, how they discuss the technology and what in their idea is the focus on. I mean, if we remember the few pages before where we saw that electric vehicles are very strong. Now, the media mostly focus on plug-in hybrids, it seems, and this is their really main field to focus on and to do the discussion around and to write their pieces about. So that is really where we see a big disconnect between these two data sets, and where we were surprised because that is not really the reality, what we see there.
Yeah, so as we look at light vehicle sales, but from propulsion technologies, you know, as Silke just said, we have hybrid. Plug-in hybrid is really quite a small percentage. And, you know, it's not expected to grow, where battery electric is greatly increasing and hybrid similarly. And especially we see that, steep growth starting in 2020 and now continuing in 2021. So I think I get to continue
yes,
here.
Yes, you get to finish.
So I think this section is really quite compelling for me as we've looked at, who's buying battery electric vehicles. And we know the incentives that we've had for the last few years, and a couple of automakers, GM and Tesla, have already surpassed the volume, and they're no longer eligible for incentives. But gee whiz, do they even need them? If we look at internal combustion engines, which are on the bottom, you can see that, the vast majority are people less than 50,000 to the 50 to 100,000, 72 some percentage. That's the population there, with, decreasing proportions as you go up. Hybrid electric, it's similar, but you lose about 10% of the people. Again, it's a cost-based phenomena, and you really see that, the people that make less than $50,000 are, significantly reduced when you go from internal combustion to a hybrid. And then you see that shift most profoundly in the battery electric plug-in hybrid, as you see the vast majority of the purchasers in the $100,000 and above. And then if you look at, the small segment of less than 50K, there's about 14% of people that are actually buying battery electric. So we're starting to see this shift in polarization of affordability, and therefore, this what I often refer to as the democratization of mobility, in this case, clean mobility, clearly going towards the upper income buyers. Next page. This just is more compelling evidence of, what has happened over the last few years. There were tax credits that were claimed on tax returns, and 85% of those were for individuals making over $100,000 a year. And this, it's not shocking based on what we just saw, but it is compelling when we think about what kind of policies we may need going forward. People in these price ranges, people who are going to buy the new Hummers, that are 110,000 starting, they don't need a tax credit, quite frankly. So how can we manage this better in the future to allow electrification to go through all stratospheres of our society? Next page. This is more evidence of what I've been talking about. Most new vehicle buyers in general here in the US have 1.5 to almost 2 times higher household income. Now this is all vehicles, and it's one of the things that we're following very, very closely, quite frankly. When the pandemic first started and people could no longer use public transit or were leery of public transit, many dealers couldn't keep cars on the lots that were less than $10,000. They were being snapped up. And we're starting to see also that the average age of a vehicle in the US is continuing to increase as well. It's gone to now, it's about 12.5 years. There are people that are predicting it's going to increase even more beyond that, and people will continue to just repair their car. As such, we're starting to almost price people out of owning a vehicle. And we've been talking about shared mobility for some time and being able to find affordable ways for people to be mobile, because mobility is really the ladders of opportunities in life, to education, to healthcare, to employment. So we're starting to price people out. Even a used vehicle right now is around about on average $23,000. There are a lot of people who can't afford that when you look at the average median household income and all of the other things that folks are spending money on these days. And inflation is starting to go up again. We know that. So all of these economic factors are pointing us to, yes, we need to make electrified vehicles, but we need to make them affordable. We need to think about the kinds of vehicles that we're putting into the market. We need to be innovative. We need to think more about a shared economy and not an owned economy. Because if we truly want equity and people to have equity in terms of mobility and into their life and opportunity, we need to find a better way to do this as an industry. Next page. And so we had, you know, some questions that Silke and I were kind of posing to one another, and I see that there are others that have come in. So Silke, I'm going to handle the first one. I think, how do we proof our green strategy is viable? Let me hear your thoughts, and I'll go back and forth with that.
Well, I'm coming from the media side, so I guess from my perspective and from the communication perspective and what we see in the data so far is really that the media don't forget, so they will go back to what you have announced before, and then compare to how the situation is and how the development is. So I guess that is really stick to your plan. That is easier said than done. I know that. But from the communication side, it will be essential to come up with a plan that the media can follow, that can be discussed publicly, that is not too visionized, but that is practical. I think that's very relevant. And then make sure that everybody follows every step, so that you just don't do it quietly and then come up in a few years and say we are done, but that we need to be able to follow it. What do you think?
Yeah, so I definitely agree that what is being said today are some high hurdles and big goals, big hairy goals. And the dollars, though, are going along with that. I think part of the key is going to be, again, how to make these affordable, how to have the right discussions with our government entities to make sure that we have the right incentives, we have the right infrastructure, that everything is aligned to progress forward. It can't be just industry saying it's their responsibility or government saying it's industry's responsibility, but it has to be done hand in hand, and we have to be very smart about it. Meaning, yes, it's great to say we want 40%, 60%, whatever number of electric vehicles only in terms of sales by 2030, which is the number being batted around at the moment. You can say that, but at the same time, you have to be thinking about what are the needs of the infrastructure? How are building codes going to change? How can I promote affordability? What about jobs and workforce? How are we going to make sure we have the right talent to manage that? What are we going to do with perhaps some of the job losses that may occur in internal combustion engine plants and or the oil and gas industry? And how are we going to retrain and reskill? We have to think about supply chains and making sure, you know, we've got these three big gorillas right now that are hitting the automotive industry. We've got semiconductors, we have the petrochemical world, now we have rubber. It's certainly not going to be the last disruption we'll have, be it caused by an environmental crisis and or a political crisis. So how can we do a good job to make sure that certain core elements in our supply chain are aligned to make this happen? So there's a lot of different things that we have to think about. And, you know, I recommend everybody to think about that and take a very pragmatic way of achieving this, and don't make a proclamation unless you have thought deeply about all of the different elements that need to be considered. And I think that's what, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's what the media is going to judge us on at the end of the day. You make a proclamation, you better do it, or you know, you will start going on that negative side of the curve.
Exactly. Yes. And that then has the direct impact on the consumer, which would lead to our next question. So
Absolutely.
We said, how do we engage not only the financial community, but also the consumer? So again, starting from the media side here, I mean, traditionally, the communication would be set up towards the financial community, make sure that our investors, that our shareholders, that everybody understands our vision, our strategy, our different models, everything that we are at the market with, and how the sales is. But then again, with social being more and more relevant, really everywhere, and taking the lead in, I don't know, showing what would be relevant and what is good and what is bad. I mean, Tesla is doing a great job in social, and so everybody is following and saying, hey, it's great. So we need to really, we see that there is the need to focus on the social aspect and to be very specific with the topics and the individual aspects. So it's not enough to give the vision, which would be, it is still relevant, but then there are these smaller aspects that we mentioned earlier, like what is the range? How do I get it? How is it developed? How is it convenient to me, and what can I do to really use it?
So I have to ask a question, then I'm also going to talk a little bit on the consumer side and what we may need to do. But, you know, when we see the media splash and we see Tesla's share of voice, they have a very flamboyant CEO that doesn't hesitate to get out and speak and say exactly what he's thinking. You know, I'm just wondering, you know, is that part of the reason for Tesla's success? Should other CEOs be doing this? I mean, is it only Tesla's secret sauce then?
Well, about an advice,
can they get away with it better than anybody else? Maybe that's my question.
I think that would be a better question, because an advice to others, just have their CEO do what Elon Musk is doing. I don't know whether that would be the right thing. He's just a figure on his own, but that is true. So a very, very big part of the Tesla coverage, if it's not in connection or as a comparison to others, it is about anything that he mentioned, that he put on social, that he have done towards one or another way. I mean, here in Europe, it's even further that everybody is engaging and interested in what he's doing now with coming to Europe. So of course, that is a very big part within that. But I think you can do better just focusing on topics. I mean, if your CEO does that, that's great. And then you have someone out there talking for you. That certainly works in any media types, but it's also a great risk. And we see that in the tonality. I mean, the minute people are not convinced, then everybody is jumping on it and saying, this doesn't make sense. And then it gets difficult.
I've been following with a lot of interest the Citroën Ami, which is a cute little product. And of course, it's not here in the US. It probably wouldn't meet our safety standards. But the one thing that I found interesting, there's been a lot of fun dialogue on actually LinkedIn. I don't know if it's on Twitter or not. But, you know, even the company themselves are calling it a toaster because it looks like a toaster. And then they're having fun with it. Oh, yeah, but it's a toaster that can take you to the cafe for your coffee and blah, 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 blah. And it's in French, and my French isn't that good, so I always have to translate it. But, you know, it's really neat because you have the people that are responsible for this product calling it a toaster and saying, yeah, we're having fun with it, but it'll fit into your life. And I'm not seeing that kind of dialogue, at least here in the US, some of this fun, you know, product discussions and the company leaders themselves getting involved in that dialogue. I don't know if that's helpful or not. It's a question I'll ask you later, but let's talk about the consumer for a minute and, you know, how to educate them. And maybe you can help me with this, because as an industry, we're not doing a very good job right now. And as dealers, perhaps they're not doing the best job either. The current people buying electric vehicles probably know more about that product than a lot of our dealers do that are representing that product. Now, Tesla doesn't have that problem in some, you know, with the way they're managing through direct sales. But when I think about what the millennials or even the Gen Zs, what do they look at? They look at ratings on Yelp. They see what's on Nextdoor. They look at ratings on websites. They listen to their neighbors and their friends. They're not convinced by what the company is telling them. So when I think about that, is there a different way that the legacy automakers should be thinking about? It's not what we put on TV or what we put in publications. It's this kind of way to chat in somebody's ear as your confidential neighbor. And how can we use that to then, really indicate how an EV is total cost of ownership, it's better. How an EV can fit into your life. It's super easy to charge. You don't have to worry about it. Within 20 minutes, you can have 70% and be on your way. How can we change that dialogue or the way that we're presenting that information so that our future consumers can really, really understand?
Well, I guess you already mentioned it. It's they are looking for someone who is like them. They are turning towards people who have their ear. So I wouldn't say the media aren't the right channel anymore, but in addition, and I do think the legacy automakers are making a good job already with that the social channels are very important, and we have all these influencers popping up, and they are good with what they are doing. So I see that consumers are doing a great job in doing research themselves and looking, what do I need for? So they are looking for the topics that are interesting to them, like range, like convenience, and then going to their blogs, to their trusted influencers, to specific tech sites. And what we see when we talk to the car makers is that they are still, as I said, they are doing a great job joining this community, but they are still very focused on the traditional way to communicate. And that might be something where there needs to come a change as well, to really get away from this high-reaching, very important top-tier media that everybody needs to be in. That is one part, but then there are the smaller ones who really have the ear of the consumer and might trigger the market decision then.
Yeah, and then the last one, the last question we had put up here, I think is one that I kind of tackled as I went through the presentation about really thinking differently, changing the narrative. It's not just we're going to build it and we're going to sell it to you, but what are those mobility services? How can we manage this through a shared economy? What are those other models, small little toasters, that we need to develop and to start producing here so that, we really have this full gamut of product that is affordable to everybody and really can help with their life. And then I think we just have to be talking about that. I think we have to understand the needs of the consumer. And I'm not sure if there's a way to excerpt that from blogs or any other information to see what people are thinking out there. Is there a way to do that? Or
well,
is that a future conversation?
You can listen to the blogs and to the social media, and I think very important there is to be market specific. So sticking with your toaster, I'm not sure whether that would fly in the US, but in Europe, so it certainly does, and it just needs to be very specific and individually to the market. We see now Norway coming up as the in market, even though car makers have known that already for a very long time, that they are very good in electric vehicles. But now with GM and with Audi doing their job in doing a great advertisement there, everybody is looking at it and saying, that's interesting, and we could do it like that. So yes, so I think there are ways to listen to the consumer, again, through social. Of course, there are the traditional ways that marketing has at its hand. But then again, there's also, we mustn't forget the market and the country and the region, how people are thinking there generally. So I think this one is really the biggest task, to answer the market question and then still make sure to stay affordable. That one probably needs some work.
Thanks. And Jennifer, I think we will turn it back to you to see if there are questions that have come in that you'd like to pose.
Yes. Well, first, thank you both to Silke and Carla. Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for your time. We actually had a bunch of questions come in, and I think we're going to have time for maybe one or two. The one that I will address that actually is relevant to myself is, will this presentation be available after this recording? And that answer is yes. All of the participants or people who signed up will receive an email with a download link, as well as we will have it posted on the respective sites of both the Center for Automotive Research as well as UNICEPTA shortly after this presentation. So if you've missed anything, you had to leave early, not that you would hear this part, but you will be able to access the full presentation following the next 3 minutes. So 2 quick questions that I just thought might be the best way to wrap this up. One person referred to slide 24 that says EV purchase mix by income slide. Are wealthy car buyers just adding an EV alongside their ICE vehicles, for example, as a second or third car as opposed to their primary?
You know, we don't have the data that tells us that. We know that people typically in this income range, though, do tend to have multiple vehicles. I can tell you most of my friends that have these vehicles also have another vehicle, usually an SUV of some sort. So I don't know if they think it balances out their carbon footprint or what, but anyway, we see that a lot. However, I do know some people who have gone to one vehicle, especially urban dwellers, and that vehicle is just an EV. So we are starting to see that shift. It's usually with the younger demographic. Time will tell how comfortable people are to be able to just have an EV. There are, of course, California is the most prominent state, and there are many higher income folks that only have EVs, but typically not just one.
Okay, thank you. And then I believe this one might be a little more directed towards Silke. Interested to understand more about how you believe COVID has positively impacted EVs.
Well, that needs a bit to go back a bit further. So with COVID, the overall idea around modern mobility became a new or got a new drift. So we had this very strong focus on the cars, on everything like they were. It was very traditional. There was already the discussion around green mobility, but that was not really kicking off, so to say. Maybe a few things came together. So we had COVID. People said, oh, look, we are staying at home and things get better. We see the environment is benefiting from us not traveling so much. And then this might also have affected the thinking about what can we do to keep that running, to maybe support it further. We have seen that it works. So how can I do my part? So that was one part for the COVID side. And then, of course, we also had the regulatory topics within the US, with California, with the new administration coming up. So these two aspects coming together really pushed the topic and the interest for it. And I think that gave this whole idea a momentum where everybody said, well, now is the time to really join it and to move forward with it.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. So that is time. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, but we can try to send along some short responses and a package deal with recording after this. So thank you to everyone who joined. We really appreciate it. And thank you again to Carla as well as Silke for taking the time to discuss modern mobility with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks,
it was
all.
great.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.